So I did put the handout in the back from last time, the calendar, or the map rather. And so you can take that piece of paper and fold it in half and put it in your Bible after the Paul's Missionary Journey map, so you've got the next piece if you want. And I apologize, I tried to upgrade the graphics, and that's not me. So if you know somebody who's good at graphics, then we should talk, because the circles are not as helpful as they could be. But it does give you some sense of where did the apostles go? What is happening in the first century beyond just the activities of Paul as chronicled in the second half of the book of Acts? So next slide. So I wanted to talk today about the other two gospel writers, among others. So John Mark is the author of the second gospel in your Bible, and what is widely regarded as the first gospel to be written. John is a very common Jewish name, and Mark was the most common Roman name for men at the time. So very common names, but both known by both a Jewish moniker and a Roman moniker. There is very limited confusion about his name and identity, though, because he is known as John Mark so consistently. He stands out from others, and there's not a lot of other Marks in the New Testament or in the early church story. So it's pretty easy to pull him out. His mother is named Mary, so she's on the list of Marys, and I didn't even include her on the list of Marys that I went through. But his mother Mary owned a house in Jerusalem, and it is apparently a house that was important in the life of the early church. It is apparently a house that Jesus visited at some point. It's a house that people came to. And when Peter is miraculously released from prison, it is the house that he runs through the dark streets to go to. And when he knocks on the door and the servant Rhoda won't let him in, that's Mary, the mother of John Mark's house, and Rhoda almost certainly works for Mary. So that house was important in the life of the church. It was a place that people gathered to pray. There is some belief in the early church that when Jesus sends two disciples to prepare the Passover and says, when you go in the gate of the city, you will see a young man or a man carrying a jar of water, which is unusual. Women usually carried the jars of water at the time. When you see the young man carrying the jar of water, follow him to the house. And when he goes into the house, go in and ask for the upper room. There are people in the early church that think that the young man was John Mark carrying the jar of water, and led them to his mother's house, and that it was at the house of Mary, the mother of John Mark, that the upper room was that they had the Last Supper in. So that's a thread that is not tied to anything very strongly, but there are people in the first 4 or 5 centuries of the church that thought that that might be true. Mark is he has both a Jewish name and a Roman name, and his mother is almost certainly Jewish, and his father doesn't figure in the story at all. And so his father may have been deceased, but there's a good likelihood that his father was a Roman or at least a Greek-speaking, culturally Greek kind of a person, and that's the reason that he ended up with the name Mark. He's the nephew or perhaps the cousin, depending on how you translate it, of Barnabas. There's a family relationship there. That's out of Colossians 4. John Mark is, of course, believed to be the young man who ran away at Gethsemane, as chronicled in Mark's Gospel. Mark has the odd little vignette of the young man who jumped out of bed in the middle of the night and chased off to Gethsemane, wrapped only in a sheet, to see what was going on. And when he sees Jesus arrested, someone tries to grab him, and he runs away naked and lets them have the sheet. So that's a story that's in the Gospel of Mark, and it is widely believed for the last basically 2 millennia that Mark is telling a story about himself, although he doesn't name himself, but that it's in the Gospel of Mark to give us a sense that Mark was a witness to at least some of the events that he is chronicling in his Gospel, that he was there when Jesus was arrested at Gethsemane. Mark was later sent to Antioch with Barnabas. When Barnabas went up there to investigate the growth of the church at Antioch and to see what was going on there, he was subsequently selected to go on Barnabas and Paul's first missionary journey, where, of course, he deserted them at Perga and went home. So when Barnabas and Paul got ready to go on another missionary journey, and Barnabas said, "Let's take John Mark," Paul said, "No way." And Paul fired him and was so strong on that point that he and Barnabas went separate ways and split up the thing. And Paul took Silas and went to Galatia, and Barnabas took John Mark and went to Cyprus, which was where they had spent the first part of their first journey. So Barnabas functions as a guy that kind of reclaims John Mark for service. He's later employed by Peter. Peter says that John Mark becomes sort of like a son to him. So he traveled with Peter at some length. It is widely believed that Peter is the key source for Mark's gospel. Mark is with Paul in Rome when he wrote Colossians and Philemon. And later on, when Paul writes 2 Timothy, the last epistle that he wrote, John Mark is the one guy that he asked Timothy to bring with him when he comes to Rome. And he says he is very useful, which is certainly not what Paul's opinion was earlier. He is the possible founder or the first major church leader of the church at Alexandria, a church that looms very large in the first couple of 3 centuries of the history of the church. And John Mark is believed to have had a major part in the foundation of that church. He is the writer of what is widely believed to be the first gospel written. A copy of Mark's gospel was found in the Dead Sea Scrolls library and is dated to before AD 50. So his gospel is attested very, very early and was written before the Jerusalem Council that's chronicled in Acts. So, the first council of Jerusalem. When they in Acts, Mark's gospel was written before that. So if it was in the Dead Sea Scroll collection by AD 50, it was written in the 40s at least, and the Jerusalem Council didn't happen until 50. So it's before. Mark's gospel seems to have been written before key events that happen in the book of Acts. So there's very early attestation and evidence for Mark's gospel, and that he may have written that gospel while he was still a relatively young man and before the death of Peter. And so there are 2nd century sources that say that Peter read Mark's gospel and approved of it. So that Peter was alive and Mark showed the gospel to him and Peter signed off on it that yes, this is correct and true. And of course, Mark's gospel is the gospel of immediately. That's Mark's favorite word, and it's the word that should poke you every time you read Mark's gospel. How often does that word show up? Mark is the gospel of action. It is written by a young man in a hurry. And of course, Mark's gospel has the least amount of talking and the most amount of doing of any of the gospels. So Mark was somewhere that, at the time of 2 Timothy, Mark must have been somewhere in that Timothy could bring him to Rome when Timothy was in Ephesus. So That maybe means the Roman province of Asia, where Ephesus was, Colossae, Laodicea. It might mean somewhere in Macedonia, because you could semi-conveniently travel through Macedonia to get to Rome from Ephesus. There is some tradition that Mark evangelized Illyria, which was northwest of Greece and what is now Albania, and that would be a place that if Timothy were coming from Ephesus and going to Rome, he could have passed through. It's on the other side of the Adriatic Sea from what is now Italy. So that kind of fits geographically. Peter, of course, says in writing his first epistle that he's writing from Babylon. A lot of people since then have believed that by Babylon he means Rome, and he's digging at Rome, he's poking Rome, he's saying something, some kind of condemnation on Rome. And that's based partly, of course, because the Revelation, in John, when writing the Revelation, uses Babylon as a symbol for Rome, but he uses lots of things very symbolically in Revelation. And Peter doesn't really write that way. Peter writes pretty straight up about where he is and what he's doing and what's going on. So there's plenty of reasons to think that Peter wrote his epistle from Babylon, that he really went there, that he went east before he went west. And if so, there's a good chance that Mark was on that trip with him. Where that fits in the timeline is hard to say, but it would be before, perhaps after Peter was in Antioch and before he passed through Corinth, maybe. There is a strong tradition that after the deaths of Peter and Paul, Mark went to Alexandria. So he may have traveled south from Rome down the Italian peninsula and then across the Mediterranean, perhaps via Sicily or Malta, to the coast of Africa. There is some tradition that Mark's family is based out of Cyrene, where Simon, who carried the cross, was also from, in what is now Libya, and that he may have gone there first and evangelized some along the coast of Africa, or the north coast of Africa, before going to Alexandria. Alexandria was the largest and most influential city in the eastern part of the empire. There were people at the time who believed if you could plant a significant church in Rome and Alexandria, you would have touched the two most influential hubs across the whole empire. And you would have made a major, major mark on the empire. Alexandria remained a very major city for the next several centuries and super influential in the Roman Empire. And so it was a great hub for ministry. Alexandria was very steeped in Greco-Roman culture, but had a very large Jewish population. It was a major stronghold of paganism at the time. And the story of the church in Alexandria over the next several centuries is the story of conflict between the church and pagan authorities and pagan worship in that place. The Egyptian Coptic Church believes that Mark came to Alexandria in AD 49, holds him as the first bishop of Alexandria, and traces some of its liturgy to John Mark. They believe that some of their current liturgy, which is very ancient, very old, was actually written by him. The apocryphal book Acts of Barnabas has Mark coming to Alexandria around AD 55 after Barnabas is martyred in Cyprus. Papias in the early 2nd century identifies the gospel with John Mark, and so does pretty much everybody else down through the ages. The one real exception to that is Hippolytus in the early 3rd century went the other direction from what we've seen on some of these other names. Many of these other names, you see the early church saying, all these Marys is too many, we'll make them, we'll overlap a bunch of them. These Judases, too many, we'll try to make all these guys more or less the same, the Jameses. The idea that we can make two people one to simplify. Hippolytus in the early 3rd century went the other direction and said, you know what? There are 3 Marks. There is the John Mark who shows up in Acts and who wrote the gospel. There is the Mark who was the cousin or the nephew of Barnabas. And there is the Mark the evangelist that Paul sent for in 2 Timothy. And those are 3 different guys. Hippolytus said that. That hasn't ever gotten much traction. But there is some early tradition that actually, instead of trying to simplify by merging people into one, instead with Mark tries to split him up into multiple different people, which is partly Hippolytus was trying to figure out how is it that the guy that Paul fired is the guy that Paul later on says, he's the one guy that I need. And of course, if you're the sort of person who believes in redemption, that's not a crazy story, right? So, but Hippolytus was a little skeptical of that. Mark was believed martyred in Alexandria about AD 68. He would have been in his 50s or maybe just past 60 or so. The tradition says he was dragged through the streets by a mob, perhaps on Easter, because Easter in that year fell on the same day as a major pagan holiday. So bottom right is a picture that tries to give you a sense of what that looks like. It's from an illuminated manuscript, which was done for a guy named John, the Duke of Berry, in Europe between 1412 and 1416. But it's a sense that in the early 1400s, this is what people thought about the martyrdom of Mark, that he was pulled out of the church, apparently during a service or on Sunday, and then dragged through the streets to his death by a mob. So others hold that maybe he was martyred early in the 2nd century, that he lives much longer, and that he had evangelized much of Egypt by that time. The church where his remains were held was sacked by Islamic invaders in AD 642, and there's a bunch of traditions that go with that, but the one thing that seems pretty common to them is that his head ended up separate from his body. His body was stolen in AD 828 by some Venetian merchants who came to Alexandria and conspired with some local Greek monks, and they smuggled his body out of Egypt and took it to Venice at the head of the Adriatic Sea, where it was greeted with great joy, and now is believed held in St. Mark's Cathedral, the main cathedral in the city of Venice. St. Mark's Coptic Orthodox Cathedral in Alexandria claims to still have his head. So there's a church, the Church of St. Pudentiana in Rome was built over a 1st century house that the people in that church claim was the house that Mark wrote his gospel in. And the monastery of St. Mark in Jerusalem is built over the foundations of a large 1st century house. And at the bottom left is a Syriac inscription from the 6th century that around 1520 was found underneath a major layer of plaster and covered over. When the plaster was removed, the 6th century inscription says, "This is the house of Mary, mother of John Mark, proclaimed a church by the holy apostles under the name of the Virgin Mary, Mother of God, after our Lord Jesus Christ went up to the heavens. It was rebuilt after the destruction of Jerusalem by Titus in the year 73. So they believe that the monastery in Jerusalem is built over Mary's house, and that is the place that John Mark lived as a young man, and that is the house that Peter was refused admittance to by the servant girl Rhoda. And that it might have been the house with the upper room where the Last Supper happened. But it was a significant early meeting place for the church. You can see the image at the top right there is Mark the Evangelist by a guy named Il Pordenone in the early 1500s, and he has a lion looking over his shoulder, and the top left there is a winged lion. It is the winged lion that is the sign of John Mark, the gospel writer. The way that you get a winged lion connected to John Mark, the gospel writer, and lions show up a lot in art that has Mark, a very common motif, is because at some point, in the first millennia anyway, at some point, the four gospel writers became associated with the four living creatures of Revelation. And Mark became associated with the winged lion of those four. And the winged lion, it was believed at the time that the lion was an animal that slept with its eyes open. And that this was symbolic of Jesus who was raised from the dead. And that the lion was kingly, and this is symbolic as Jesus, therefore Jesus the resurrected king. And so that became associated with Mark because of some of the themes of his gospel. Matthew is long associated with the winged man, the angel, the winged creature that has the face of a man, as a symbol of Christ as God incarnate. Luke is associated with the winged ox or bull, which is associated with the idea that Christ is the perfect sacrifice and the priest by whom we connect with God. And John is the winged eagle, the winged creature with the face of an eagle, because his gospel kind of soars over the others and is about the logos, the divine. In any case, that's a tradition that you see in the art that comes out of this. So in the bottom right, you've got this is sort of the church on the right side here, and there's a guy inside leading worship or something, and so Mark is being dragged out the door of the church and into the street by the mob. And the mob is a group of people of various races, which is very Alexandria of the moment. And they have weapons to beat him and are intent on dragging him to his death. But the picture looks more like Europe in the 1400s, but Alexandria was a very urban, heavily populated, big city at the time. So anyway, so this is a picture kind of from Renaissance Europe of what this might have looked like, and it says a bunch of things about Renaissance Europe in the way that the artist has chosen to depict this. But this is an illuminated manuscript, right? This is a manuscript that had the text of Mark's gospel, among other things, in it, and the artist added these pictures along the way to make it interesting to read, a picture book. Very, very common in that era. But as Paul said, Mark was ultimately useful. the gospel writer, the witness to the arrest of Jesus at Gethsemane, the partner of Barnabas, the servant and sort of son of Peter, the helper of Paul, and the probable first leader of the church at Alexandria, John Mark. The fourth in my order of talking about gospel writers is, of course, Luke, who wrote the third gospel in your Bible, and is almost always portrayed writing. Even though, once again, these guys are writing in bound books, which is not the way that Luke would have done it. But the one on the right is St. Luke by Guido Reni in 1621, and I thought a very interesting portrait. And the other is at left, there is an altarpiece that was done by a guy named Andrea Mantegna in the 1450s in Milan. So he is almost always depicted writing or with a book, and of course he's often depicted with an ox or a bull, which are sometimes winged in keeping with the four-winged creatures theme. There is some early tradition that he was a painter, which would make him truly kind of a Renaissance man, since he was a doctor and a historian. And so if you add artistic talent onto the top of that, that's a pretty amazing person. So Luke says at the beginning of his gospel that he is not an eyewitness to Jesus. And so he says that he was not present for any of the things that happened in the Gospels. But he's a very careful chronicler with a great eye for detail. He's a man of serious culture, steeped in Greek thinking. He is almost certainly not a Jew. Paul says he is not of the circumcision, which means that if he was a Jew, he was a very Hellenized, culturally distant Jew, but it's likely that he was Greek or that he was at least of the Greek culture. He is a very stylish storyteller. His authorship of Luke and Acts is universally accepted in the early church, and he wrote more of the New Testament than either Paul or John. Depending on how you count this, the official figure is usually about 27.5% of the New Testament is written by Luke. He is probably the only New Testament author who's a Gentile, so he's not Jewish. So, and he as a historian, he's been controversial for a long time, but his geography, his titles for people, his cultural details are right down the line. He is never incorrect on those kinds of things. So very little is known of his background or life. Of the four gospel writers, we know the least about Luke, much less than we know about Matthew. The bit about him being an artist and a painter goes back to the 8th century, but not apparently earlier. But from the 8th century, there's a belief that he painted icons, he painted little pictures of Mary, Peter, and Paul, and others, and that he did so from life, that he met these people and sat down and sketched them out, and then made paintings that were passed around in the early church. There's not any evidence for that before the 8th century. But as a result of that, in medieval Europe, the painters' guilds called themselves the Guilds of St. Luke. Guild of what? The Guilds of St. Luke. The painters' guilds called themselves the Guilds of St. Luke. They named their organizations after him, in the belief in medieval Europe that he had also been a painter, that he had also painted on the side. So hard to know whether there's any truth to that. There's no evidence before the 8th century about that. There's nothing that exists or that has been passed down, but that is a tradition that has stuck. And you can find medieval paintings of Luke painting. There's quite a few of those. What we do know is that when Paul gets to Troas on his second missionary journey, that he joins Paul there. And he may have joined Paul because Paul's medical needs, that Paul needed some kind of medical care. Paul's a guy who's a high-stress guy who drove his body very hard, and on top of that had whatever his thorn in the flesh was, and is always depicted with a stooped back. And so the likelihood that Paul needed some kind of ongoing medical care is that's a real likelihood there. There's a real possibility that was part of what happened. For some reason, Luke stayed in Philippi when they got to Philippi, which has led some people to believe that maybe he was from Philippi. Maybe he was a local guy. But the church, the beginnings of a church, Lydia, the seller of purple cloth, the jailer and his family, those people that Paul left behind when Paul leaves Philippi, Luke is left there, which might make him the first pastor of the church at Philippi. So for whatever reason, when Paul returned to Philippi on his way, headed eventually to go back to Jerusalem, Luke rejoins him and travels with him after that. Luke is with him apparently in Jerusalem. He's with him in his 2 years of imprisonment in Caesarea. It's possible that Luke used that time to go venture around, go up to Jerusalem, go to Galilee, go talk to people. He might have been able to meet Mary and others at that time, in that he wrote his gospel during those 2 years. It became very evident early in that time that Felix had no intent of disposing of Paul's case, and that Paul was going to be there perhaps as long as Felix was. So they would have given Luke some freedom to go places, to go visit things, to be gone for a month and know that when he got back that Paul wasn't going to be gone, or that something wasn't going to have happened, because Felix seemed extremely uninterested in bringing the case to any resolution. He traveled with Paul to Rome and stayed there with him for the 2 years that he was under house arrest there. And that may be when he wrote the book of Acts. And that may be why the book of Acts ends the way that it does, because Luke wrote it while Paul was under house arrest. And when they got to the end of the 2 years, he ended it thinking that, I'll write later about what happens after, because I don't know where we're going to go or what we're going to do. And Luke is with Paul at the end. In 2 Timothy chapter 4, only Luke is with me. So when Paul is in the dungeon under the sentence of death, Luke is there. So in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, but thanks be to God who put into the heart of Titus the same earnest care I have for you. For he not only accepted our appeal, but being himself very earnest, he is going to you of his own accord. With him we are sending the brother who is famous among all the churches for his preaching of the gospel. People have always wondered, who's the brother? There are some translations of this that it's not the brother, it's his brother, Titus's brother. There is an early tradition that the brother of Titus was Luke. They were both Gentiles, and maybe they were related. That's not very strong, but it would help answer an interesting question, which is, why is Titus not mentioned even once in the book of Acts? In all the places in the second half of the book of Acts, all the people that are traveling with Paul, all the people that Paul is invested in, Titus isn't mentioned once. But Titus, Paul writes a letter to him that's part of the canon. Titus is mentioned several times in Paul's letter. Well, if Titus was Luke's brother, then Luke probably wouldn't mention him because that would seem unseemly. And so culturally, that's a fit. In any case, that's a long shot, but that is a thing that people down through the ages have spent some time pondering and thinking about. So what did Luke do after Paul's death in AD 64 or thereabouts? He seems to have gone to Boeotia in northern Greece, primarily to the city of Thebes, which is west from Philippi and Thessalonica a ways, in well north of Athens. And surrounded by, Boeotia is an area of Greece that's kind of surrounded by mountains and high hills. And so it's a big flat area in northern Greece that is geographically distinct from the rest of Greece. So as a missions target, it's a good idea. It is believed that Luke died in Thebes of Boeotia in AD 84, or maybe in AD 93, or maybe just when he was 84, and that he was buried there, and that he may have been martyred by being hanged from an olive tree. There is a Roman-style tomb in Thebes that still exists. It's from the 1st century, and is believed to be associated with Luke. It's empty. His relics are believed to have been removed to Constantinople in 356 or 357 AD, and some then on to Rome. St. Peter's Basilica in Rome claims to have his head, but so does a church in Prague. And there is an abbey in Padua, Italy, that claims to have the body of Luke. In any case, the abbey in Padua, the remains that are there have been carbon dated to sometime between the 1st and 5th century, and they are of a Syrian man who died probably in his 70s. So maybe. In any case, Luke is a great writer, a great historian, a reliable and very useful companion of Paul, a very astute observer and chronicler of events, and a trustworthy guy for us to read and listen to. His details are consistently right down the line.